I'm Paul Noglows, executive producer at Crusonia. Thanks for joining us for this month's Crusonia conversation. Crusonia brings together innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, experts, and people passionate about the premise that food is health, to both drive awareness and, more importantly, find actionable solutions. In the US, we spend more on healthcare for diet-related illnesses than we do on food itself. This will continue until we collectively commit to change and find practical, actionable ways to make good food as craveable, delicious, and affordable as bad. Until we get to a place where food works to prevent and reverse the health crises we face today instead of foster them. These conversations and our annual forum work to bring valuable information and advanced dialogue from corporations to kitchens. Again, thanks for joining us today. And thanks for being part of the journey to better. Because food is health, and change starts here.
I'm Carter Williams, CEO of iSelect. We focus on hard problems. One of those hard problems is Americans spend $1.6 trillion every year on food, but spend nearly $2 trillion on diet-related illnesses like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. Each of these is fatal in their own rights. They're more fatal when they're comorbidities for COVID-19. These are tough problems. We believe that you cannot solve the healthcare challenge we face without the evolution to a new, better, and more nutritious food system. Our work at iSelect and the broader work we're doing with Crusonia is focused on bringing the right people together to make this happen, to affect the change, to bring entrepreneurs forward, large corporations, healthcare systems, and patients together to make real progress, to solve the problem associated with healthcare, to introduce better food, to make it so that food and health are combined as a solution to improve our quality of life. Our hope is that results are measured not only through the traditional financial metrics, but through a fundamental and positive impact on reversing the footprint and impact of diet-related illness.
Hi, I'm Paul Noglows, executive producer at Crusonia, and today's conversation is focused on putting a price on carbon and whether it represents a real opportunity for bipartisan cooperation. We are fortunate to be joined in this conversation by Jody Longshore, Vice President of Sales, Marketing, and Sustainability at Sentera, James Glueck, former Staff Director, U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and Carter Williams, CEO of iSelect, a St. Louis-based venture capitalist focused on investing at the nexus of food and health. In February, iSelect did a very insightful deep dive on the science of soil carbon sequestration. Today, we are going to try to move beyond the science to focus on the evolving perception of soil-based carbon sequestration and developments in terms of carbon markets, as well as the role of industry and government in helping shape and make this a reality. We highly encourage audience participation, as this truly is a conversation. You should pose your questions through the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as time permits. With that, let's start off with soil carbon markets are nascent, but are growing on a worldwide basis, and it seems to be all anyone wants to talk about. Is there consensus as to how they are developing and being built? Anyone jump in?
Yeah, so, I think what we're seeing is that there's a lot of different organizations taking different approaches to carbon markets. And, in a lot of respects, I think that's actually a positive thing because there are different participants on both the buy and sell side may have different requirements as far as what they're willing to pay, the level of verification that they're willing to accept or to participate in, whether if it's on the production side. And so I think it's a really interesting time seeing all of these different approaches to creating an opportunity to trade carbon.
Yeah, no, I think I'd echo that there's not a clear consensus on what a credit looks like or what that price looks like, but it is in that early stage. I mean, everything from a trading platform to folks who are looking at more of a contract construct. And so a pretty wide range within the marketplace.
For agriculture, how does this translate to educating farmers and interacting with other industries?
I think farmers know, better than most anyone else that the role of carbon and the importance of quality soil. And so I think they've come to this conversation a lot better informed than others in the value chain. I think there's a lot of activity within that value chain, downstream consumer-facing players, very interested in engaging in the conversation. But really, the rubber hits the road on the farm and getting farmers engaged and to see the benefit. I think the challenge from a farmer's perspective is trying to put that economic benefit on that farm as well. Making changes in practices and how they do their production. What is the impact on cost or benefit?
Yes, I think when we talk to farmers, we see a lot of both excitement and apprehension about this. And on the excitement side, I think a lot of farmers look at the requirements for sustainable farming and or sequestering carbon, and they look at the practices that contribute to it, and they see things that they're already doing anyways, or that they're adopting at an increasing rate. And so they see this as an opportunity to get credit for the good things that they're already implementing and or have implemented in the past. And then I think there's a little bit of apprehension on the potential for increased regulation or oversight, or reducing their license to operate, those sorts of things. And so I think it's there's sort of mixed feelings about it, but I think for the most part, the way that things stand today, I think there's a lot of excitement about the opportunity that it presents.
I had a question come to me before the conversation started, but are established carbon markets, such as in forestry, where there's an established spectrum of credits, are these being used as models, or are we effectively reinventing the wheel?
So I think they are being used as models. I think one of the challenges is that today there is not a universally accepted methodology for quantifying carbon, and there are still some questions to be answered around things like permanence of carbon that is sequestered through agriculture and things like that. So I think as far as the structure of the markets go, I see some similarities to what's been done with like green palm and things like that in the past, in the palm oils industry and in forestry as well. So there's certainly some similarities there, but I think there's still some work to be done on arriving at an agreed upon standard.
Yeah, I'd say where we're at today versus 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when Congress last really looked at this with any seriousness in the cap and trade conversation, a lot of certainty on sort of a very rigid approach. I mean, this conversation is really more driven by that consumer demand. As these markets evolve, it's trying to hit that pinpoint of what the consumer demand looks like when it comes to the credit. So that to maintain that voluntary approach, that market-based approach, which seems to be some of the underlying points in the conversation from a legislative perspective.
And I thought I'd throw one at Carter. On our prep call last week, we talked about how in many instances, this seems to be presented to farmers as a way to make money. And, this seems somewhat cynical if you take a step back, but is it the right approach, or is it the necessary approach in order to get people to really start to embrace this?
I don't think we know the answer to that. Farmers probably know better than anybody that if they put more carbon in the ground, they increase performance. They've probably known that for 20,000 years in one way or the other. And I've seen a few different versions of this. I've seen some people that are very passionate on the climate issue say farmers don't understand. So that's annoying. I have also seen people who represent the farmer community that are eager if we can make more money by saying that we've packaged up this carbon in a different way and you want to pay me more for it, go for it. So you've got those are imperfect extremes in the conversation. And then we look at, 10 new companies a week that are focused on a combination of agronomy and genetics and crop inputs that, frankly, from a venture standpoint, we can see a future in which the combination of those things brought together effectively lets the farmer increase yield, increases soil health, and reduces the cost of the output, and increases the margin, reduces the cost of the input, and increases the farmer's margins. And so if I were left alone, I would, I'll say this every day of the week, I'd let innovation move its path forward and try to sort of keep the markets at bay. But I think we're clearly in a position where farmers are more than happy to figure out a way to package this up if we can package it up and, near term, get extra capital to help accelerate the innovation cycle.
Yeah, when you talk about revenue opportunities from this, I think there's actually a number of different ways that people are looking at revenue streams. So, the one is direct payment for carbon sequestration, but another is, as you improve soil health, you reduce the variation of outcomes that you get in farming. So there's a risk reduction piece there, which I know some people are starting to look at from a lending and insurance perspective. There's also increased yield opportunities that are associated with improving your soil health. In addition to that, as you increase soil carbon, because you increase the yield potential of the ground, you also increase the value of the land asset. So from a land ownership and investment perspective, there's an opportunity there. So there's actually a lot of different ways that farmers can profit from pursuing a better soil health and sustainable agricultural production.
Yeah, to build on this, we haven't named the rule, but we have a rule in our sort of investment horizon that if the half-life of the legislation is less than the time it'll take the technology to reach dominant design, avoid the subsidy from the legislation. So let me say that another, if we're an election away from policy maybe swinging the other way, it's very hard for a farmer to say, I'm going to invest time, money, resources in going after a credit if my payback is 4 or 5 years and the legislation may change in a year. The converse on that is, I think, from the policy standpoint, where there's an acknowledged concern about how carbon fits into the overall world. I think it's important for policymakers to think through this issue in terms of, well, is there a way for us to insert capital into the front end of this to trigger the innovation cycle and get the momentum of that innovation cycle going? I think in all markets we see, like, a cell phone market doesn't thrive because of a subsidy. It thrives because it's gotten better and better and better. Now it may be kicked off in a particular way. So I think that the more that the policymakers can sort of see what the roadmap is for some of these technologies, we're in the nascent part of some of the next generation technologies in which it's possible that just through the common practice of farming, that we may see these things all line up over the next 4 or 5 years to a point where this problem sort of works itself out with a lot of complexity. When we first talked about things like trees, for the most part, I'm ignorant on how that market works, but I'll pretend I think I know what that market does. And that is grow trees for 50 years. Trees contain a certain amount of carbon. It's observable. Planting, things getting knocked around in planting, soil getting disrupted, cover crops getting disrupted, cover crops growing and then being decaying. And, the dynamic on the farm is a more rapid dynamic than I'm going to go grow trees for 75 years. So again, I think if we can help the policymakers better understand what the learning curve is going to be on the farm to enhance better practices, we might be able to come up with an approach that increases farming's contribution to the carbon goals without having to sit there and debate over whether policies are going to change next year.
I guess the question, Carter, so, you talk about policies changing, but really the genesis of this conversation was, we were looking at this and we said, with the new administration in, and is this an opportunity for true bipartisan cooperation in terms of trying to figure it out? And so I'll put it to James, is this an opportunity now? And does perhaps that bipartisan cooperation, does that continue regardless of what happens in terms of the top ranks?
Yeah, I think there definitely is an opportunity now. I think hopefully it's one that's realized. And I say that, looking just from a Senate Ag perspective, this is something that has bipartisan interest and has had it for the last several years. There have been hearings in the Ag Committee, at least, to talk to folks in the livestock sector and some, in the research community about what has changed in agriculture over the last 10 years, to try to really inform members about all the work that was done, mostly consumer driven or farmer driven in that window of the last 10 to 15 years. I think there's bipartisan interest. The Senate Ag Committee actually moved a bill just last week, last Thursday. That was a bipartisan bill from Senator Braun from Indiana and Senator Stabenow, the chair from Michigan, that was mostly focused on technical assistance, technical advisors for farmers, really focused on that tech transfer to make sure that these questions on how do I engage on my farm, as well as an advisory committee is included in that bill to inform the secretary on the marketplace and what's happening in the space to ensure that USDA is really engaged. So I think strong bipartisan support for that bill. I think it has somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats, and it moved out of the committee on a voice vote just less than a week ago. And so I point to that as there is bipartisan opportunity and interest at this moment. If we look back, like I said, 12 years ago to the last time Congress really looked at this topic, you had a bill that came out of the House, very, very partisan in its approach with Waxman-Markey, the more rigid approach of cap and trade, very directive on the electricity side, particularly. Not a lot of flexibility for food processors and others within the value chain. And that's something that, the conversation screeched to a halt. And so I think there is bipartisan opportunity as well, as long as folks are willing to sort of give and take and sort of be thoughtful in how they engage and really question that role of what is government's opportunity here. Is it focused on research, as opposed to a more heavy-handed regulation, which, if you look up and down that value chain from a farmer where they sit, sure, there could be opportunity, but when they start thinking about it, limits on the input side or additional costs on the processing side or transportation side could put things to a screeching halt. And so I think there is a lot of interest and there is a lot of bipartisan opportunity as long as folks are sort of realistic about what's possible.
And do we ever look to others? Again, before this conversation, I had a conversation and, if I understand it correctly, Australia has taken a lead on establishing carbon markets with the full backing of the government. Canada has a carbon market in each province. So thinking a little bit more about what do you think the government's role will ultimately be in the U.S.? Do you have any kind of view on that?
Yeah, I will say that the messaging right now from Republicans and Democrats in Congress, on House and Senate, as well as the Biden administration, is fairly focused on voluntary and market-based. That takes into account this big uncertainty on the trade front. I mean, U.S. agriculture heavily dependent on being competitive around the world. I'd say now, after the last several years, probably more than ever. And so that was part of the challenge. 12 years ago was handcuffing of our export with additional cost or questions there. And so I think, I will say the Biden administration recognizes the complexity here. I mean, in the early days, bringing on, John Kerry in a very international focused role, and Gina McCarthy, former EPA administrator, in a very domestic focused role, recognizes that this is sort of that yes and approach to the global view as well as what's happening here at home.
Okay, and I think in your earlier comments, James, one of my questions was, are we at a point where we can put an agreed upon price on carbon? And so I'd just be interested in, from each of you, do you think we're there yet or no?
I'll go first, Jody. But I personally don't think we're there yet. I mean, from where the government sits today, it's a lot of focus on asking questions and trying to get answers to questions. The government's role, it probably isn't best served on intervening in that. What is a price? I know there's probably a lot of interest in that, and some in the marketplace. But also, to Carter's earlier point, that will guarantee that there are winners and losers solely based on that government decision.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that anybody can say what the price for carbon is or should be yet. I do like the idea that there are different markets that are taking different approaches and will probably have different prices based on the level of verification that's required and the rigor associated with it and things like that, which gives people options. I think one of the concerns with having the government get involved in this sort of thing is that if they do anything that hurts farmers' profits or their ability to operate, agricultural outputs are global commodities, and so if you put U.S. farmers at a disadvantage as compared to other farmers around the globe, then that negatively impacts their profitability and their ability to continue operations. It's also tough to set a fixed price or a one standard fits all model as well, because there's so many local nuances to agriculture, whether it's different soil types or different weather or different size of operations depending on geography or all kinds of different uncontrollable variables that farmers have to deal with. And so I think it's really hard to take a one size fits all approach. So.
Okay. One thing you had mentioned in your comments, Jody, what about additionality? And so, the concept, it seems in some cases, the programs are entirely focused on benefiting new or incremental initiatives and aren't necessarily recognizing or rewarding those that are already doing this. Is there a consensus on baselining, or do the starting blocks continue to be reset?
I don't think there's a consensus. I mean, different programs are looking at it in different ways. Depending on how much data that you have going back in time, there are a lot of programs that will give farmers credit for things that they've done in the past, which in many respects seems like the right thing to do. There are others that you pick a starting point when you join the program and then go forward from there. The concern with farmers is those who are farther out ahead feel like they have are getting essentially penalized for being first movers, and to some extent they are, and in another respect they're also maybe ahead of the game because they've probably got healthier soils and they've benefited from better production as a result of getting on board earlier. So they probably took these steps for all of the right reasons from a production perspective in the first place. And so just because they were ahead of the game doesn't necessarily mean that they're being penalized. But yeah, again, that's why I think it's good to have a multitude of approaches available.
Okay.
There is also a rigidity that I don't think it's been acknowledged, and James, have never asked you this, but we certainly have recently seen through the work by the National Wildlife Foundation that suggests that of the 30 or so principal crops in California, that about 20 of them really would grow better in the Delta region. That a combination of the quality of the soil there, or the availability of water, or the low cost power, transportation to East Coast markets, and just the shifts in climate that are the longer term trends of shift to climate that will sustain themselves for some time, that there's an economic case to be made to shift that production to the Delta. And I would think in a combination of that, you might, if you're using less water in California, you're not draining water reserves, less fire, there's this sort of macro level effect. And I don't know if there's a market, like if we did carbon markets, whether a price on carbon would properly price that rigidity in a way that the market would recognize the rigidity needs to move. And that's a sort of a macro level effect that there are a combination of things that have made the industry that way and prevented it from moving. And I don't know whether those are market-based things preventing it from moving or whether those are policy-based things preventing it from moving. But that's like as we think about, and as we've gotten exposed to some of the innovations coming down the pike, that's sort of if you were God and you could rearrange things, you'd sort of wonder about that shift and whether that shift should be made as if we think about sort of US policy production.
Yeah, and I'd say there are probably also some cultural challenges. I mean, looking at
Yes.
different parts of the country, and I think Jody touched on just making sure that the flexibility on pricing ensures that growers from different regions can participate in the marketplace as it develops. And I think that's something that that complexity can't be over described, because it is very challenging. I mean, if someone does make a change in their production, whether it's a crop or how they handle it, some confidence that shift makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, from a farmer's perspective, all of this has to make economic sense to their operation, and not just to them themselves, but oftentimes that lens shifts to their daughter and son in that next generation of growers as well.
So I wanted to get to some of the questions coming in. So Rob Neal has a question for Jody. He said, you said one problem is that there is not a universally accepted method for quantifying carbon. What solutions do you see emerging?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that's being done as more people are looking at the opportunity to sequester carbon in soils to try and I guess affirm or quantify the opportunity and the impact that different practices have on sequestering carbon and then on measuring it. I think one of the big questions that is still up for debate is the permanence of some of that sequestration, which can really only be measured over time, right? And so I think the solutions are around research, around having more people looking at it, and to some extent having people look at it over time. And again, I think that's where the opportunity is for there to be multiple approaches. And over time, some of those will be shown to be superior to the others, and so competition will sort of weed out, I think, the approaches that are better from those that don't work as well.
Great. I've got another question from Guy Pinard. If carbon increase of soil would become a revenue source for farmers, should a decrease in carbon content of the soil become a cost to farmers? So it sounds kind of the carrot and the stick.
Yeah, so I guess I can maybe take that first. I think a carbon decrease in soils is already a cost to farmers. And that cost being that if you decrease the carbon in soils, you increase the variability of outcomes that farmer is going to achieve from a yield and cost of operations perspective as weather impacts their operations. Soils with more carbon in it hold moisture better. And so if you have a drought and you have decreased the carbon in your soils, you're going to have a bigger impact from that. You'll probably also produce lower yields. And so, in the short term, a farmer can reduce the carbon in their soils and essentially mine the soil and maybe produce better profits over a short period of time. But in the long run, it will cost them. So, I don't know that you necessarily have to create a stick for it, because I think that is already recognized to exist by most farmers.
Okay. I want to try to expand the conversation a little bit and move beyond the farm. In terms of industry, we've seen a bunch of press releases from the likes of FedEx, United Airlines, Amazon. I think we had one recently from Apple, where they announced major billion-dollar investments in carbon reduction. And then they put a target date for reaching very specific goals. And, and so if we just got done saying, we're not at a point where we can put an agreed upon price on carbon, I'm just wondering, are these goals reachable in the timeframes laid out? Or is this just good PR at this point? Or are they putting out these releases and, in the confidence that they're going to be able to figure it out later?
I might start that, when I said we're in a very different place in the conversation than we were 10, 12 years ago, I think a lot of it's driven by this consumer interest and this the kind of consumer facing interest. Airlines, energy companies, even very different positions. I mean, we've even seen the U.S. Chamber come out and, focused on marketplace solutions on the climate front. Very different than we were, 10, 12 years ago. But in my opinion, there's still so many unknowns on kind of what a credit looks like, how a credit operates, given the information that's currently available, that a lot of it is driven by excitement and interest and wanting to be a player. I mean, it seems like no matter where you sit in that value chain, whether you're the farmer who's been familiar with these issues, as I think Carter mentioned, for eons, or you're that consumer facing, food company or a transportation entity that's wanting to be part of that conversation, I think there's a lot of information is lacking. A lot of those announcements are high level commitments with the details to come later. Even if they might fall a bit short, in 2030, 2050, I think that research that's being done to hit those targets is going to make this conversation a lot better informed in the next several years.
If we look back at what happened on the energy effort, so call it 09, 10, 11, when there was a lot of pressure on corporations on transportation and other issues, a lot of corporations said, look, we're going to track this. We're going to pay attention to it. We're going to try to get on it. And they made various decisions at the time. And I generally think that moved in the right direction. Now, they may have manifested it like we're going to build all lead buildings. And they initially said we're going to build lead platinum. And then they sort of said, well, we'll do lead gold or lead silver. And they sort of evolved their mission. And I think they just generally move in the right direction. So I think that that's a positive force. Are they available? When we think about adapting this, I would say that we've got sort of three clumps of things. We've got the first clump, which is, this is stupid simple. We could change this practice. It would cost less. We have the technology and it would deliver X. So that's the first. The second class takes a little bit of effort. I've got to buy new hardware, new gear. I've got to change. It's a little bit more involved. The cost benefit is longer. It's a little uncertain. But over time with normal swap out of equipment, I'll make that change. And the last bit is, hey, this is a pretty radical change. We don't even have the technology to do it. I don't know in the farming community, how much is it of type 1 right now? What we are seeing with regenerative, what we're seeing with some use of biologics, we're seeing advancements in nitrogen fixation technology that may create some radical changes. I think that we're going to come up with in short order, already have, and in short order, we'll reach some practices that are very easy on a market-based basis to adopt. And frankly, if some of the corporations even act as a bit of a pressure point to help bring some focus, generally corporations do a better job messaging than policymakers. If Walmart and Whole Foods say, well, here's the way Walmart did it. Walmart would say, look, we're going to pay X for LTL shipping, but if you're natural gas rather than diesel, we're going to buy more of your stuff, given the choice. And so that just nudges people in the right direction. So I think it's a positive force. I would not expect over the long term Apple to be the reason why this problem is solved. They got to focus on the phone business.
Yeah, I think if you look at the commitments that a lot of these companies have made, they're big enough in scale that most of these companies can't do it within their own four walls. If you do a life cycle analysis on most of these consumer products, the primary environmental impact comes out of the supply chain. And so, these big commitments are made, and then they look back at the supply chain, which, often begins with agriculture, and they say, all right, I need you to help me achieve the goal that I've committed to. And then there's always the challenge of, okay, well, who pays, right? And, I think one of the things that we have seen over time is that as more technology is adopted in agriculture, we see things moving in the right direction anyways, just because it's competition drives it, and farmers are becoming more efficient because that makes them more profitable, helps them maintain or grow their operations and stay in business. And as more technology becomes available in ag, I think we will continue to see an acceleration in the improvements in the efficiency of agricultural production. And so that that demand from the end of the supply chain, from the consumer side of the supply chain, can only help to accelerate both the technology development and its adoption. So I think that's all positive, and all accrues to the benefit of agriculture as we adopt more and more technology to become more efficient and more sustainable. Because I don't think there's necessarily a conflict of interest between sustainable agriculture production and profitable agriculture production. You can and necessarily have to do both at once. And so whether a farmer pursues either one of those aims, I think they arrive at the same place in the end.
Yeah, they will. They are. We certainly seen from a technology standpoint, they've probably already converged. So regenerative, there's more enough comfort that regenerative can operate effectively. I think there are two rigidities that I don't understand how to deal with. So one of those rigidities is the ethanol market says, make this amount of corn and make it this way. And it's a large part of the market. And so that's a challenge. And the other part of the rigidity is fertilizer is effective, and you got to make fertilizer in big plants. That's almost like a coal plant from a standpoint of you got to produce this huge volume. You can't increment down. There's not a lot of variability in that. And so one thing that we've looked at on the venture side a little bit, we haven't really succeeded at this, but we've sort of been like, okay, can we find a way to use ethanol plants to use corn for another product? And a product would be like synthetic silk. So a higher value product uses corn, uses the same fermentation process as ethanol. And can we swap people away and then move them into a different kind of market that, if you can then make textiles in a more efficient, effective way, you've created a higher value added product, and you start to blur. But I think as we have made a bunch of policy decisions that have sort of created these rigidities in the system, and we're going to have to figure out how to back out of them over time, or what we may very well see is people from the ethanol lobby or people from the fertilizer lobby come in and say, look, we're rent seeking, we want to do things in a particular way, and that they'll sort of pollute the policy in an opposite direction, where naturally the technology around regenerative is getting to the point that we would expect higher quality product, lower carbon footprint, and more profitability.
Okay. I want to get to a couple more questions that have come in. We had a question from Catan at UcoAg, and he's asking, how do we account for historic regenerative practices that farmers have been following when quantifying carbon? I think you might have touched on this, Jody.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question that there's maybe no perfect answer for. There are programs that will allow for farmers to get credit for things that they've done in the past, as long as they have the data and the records to go back in time and show the changes that they made and the outcomes that they achieved from those. So I think that's great. And then hopefully those farmers who were early adopters did it for all of the right reasons, and will continue to push forward. And so so whether or not they get paid for things that they did in the past, they're probably better off anyways for having done it. In terms of their operation is probably more profitable and more valuable as a result. So I think there's both opportunities there.
Okay. I've got another question from this one from Neil Clemens. Farmers he's talked to are interested in this whole thing until they hear about the need for 3 years of data and operations across the field, plus invoices for products supplied. One study I saw from a farm management company suggested fewer than 5% of farms actually have this level of data.
Yeah, that's certainly probably a true statement. I think there's more and more farmers that are using digital tools for record keeping, and there are systems like John Deere Operations Center that keeps records of what has been done. Sentera, one of the things we do is combine data from all kinds of different sources to try and create a record that can be used for these purposes. So one of the challenges is even where the records do exist, they're usually all over the place, and so you have to pull all of that information together in order to put it together in a package. And so yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think it's one that going forward is probably less of an issue because so much of agriculture is now done, both the financial transactions and the practices are applied. There's a digital record of everything that's happening now in many cases.
And Jody, I assume that comments around being organic, right? Or is that around carbon credits? The 3 years reminds me of an organic comment. Is that right?
I'm not sure from the question, but there are some of the carbon markets require you to have even 5 or more years of baseline data to bring to the table, because they want to, where they are concerned with additionality, they essentially want to see what you have done in the past, so that if you're going to get credit for a practice change now, that you're essentially not taking credit for a practice change that you've already done, which is not going to sequester additional carbon. So many of even the carbon markets do require you to go back in time with data.
Yep. And I think Jody touched on earlier, I mean, that price for carbon, there could be a premium price for someone that has all this verifiable data, but someone who's engaged more from a practice perspective, there could be opportunity there, maybe just less rich of a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
We had a follow-up question from Catan. He asked, I'm not sure if it's a he or she, do you think the accepted solutions will be more around precise measurement, or will predictive modeling based on farmer practice be accepted?
James, maybe I'll give mine, and then I'll let you elaborate. So, I think in the near term, the practice-based is going to gain a lot of traction immediately, and then over time, I think we will see a shift where more measurement will be required in order to verify these things. I mean, I think we've seen this happen in other sustainability models. If you look at like the palm oil industry, for example, the first palm oil green palm credits and things like that were mass balance. They were based on practices that were done. They weren't necessarily traceable through a supply chain. And then, over time, we've seen companies pay more and be more interested in being able to trace things back specifically through their supply chain. And so I think what we'll see is over time, probably near term practice-based, long term, probably more measurement will be required. There's some additional technology that we need to develop as an industry in order to make the cost and the effort required to measure carbon at scale to make that possible and more efficient. That's today it's a huge manual effort to go out and get enough soil samples to do that. So
yeah, and that's what I was going to hit on, is the scale question. I mean, that's really, I think, the limiting factor here is to ensure that folks across the country, different types of operations, different sizes of operations, have that ability to participate, to build that scale, to really make this work generally from a farm perspective. I think is key, and that argues for a more practice-based approach for the majority of folks in the near term.
And there's research being done now. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, of that, what does a perfect situation look like versus what does a possible situation look like? And I think the conversation 10, 12 years ago was really focused on perfect. And I think this more market-based evolutionary approach that we're seeing right now driven by consumers is really more possible focused.
Yeah, there's research being done now on things like using different wavelengths of light and satellite imagery and things like that to measure carbon remotely, or on machine equipment that would measure carbon in real time as a piece of equipment travels across a field. I mean, there's all kinds of technology that is not quite there yet, but is in various pipelines or stages of development that I think will over time make the process of getting more samples more efficiently possible.
Then we had a question from Richard Miller. And I think I'll throw this at Carter. Is there a fund investing in regenerative farms, transformation with farmers, and capturing a return with carbon? What size farm makes this viable for investor, with family farms to be educated on the transformation? I'm not sure. I think the question is, what size farm makes this viable for an investor?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a good answer on that. I do know that there are organizations, Family Farm Group and such, and the Family Farms Foundation, that are working collaboratively to sort of help people through on the regenerative side. We have seen a business model that I believe works down to about 500 acres that's focused around a combination of crop and animals, and it's a little bit going back to more of a classic farming practice. The animals on the land actually helps with some of the regenerative. So there are a few mixes like that I've seen that suggest performance at below 1,000, below 500 acres. What we're seeing in terms of some of the more regenerative practices, and Jody, I don't know if you've seen something different, but we tend to see an operator that's sort of got 8,000 acres, which is not small, and sometimes I call them the Chevy farmer, meaning they're looking for a value, but they're willing to look for something with quality, and so they will dedicate 2,000 acres to test plot some of these acres, and they have a little bit more time to think through the issues, pay attention to the issues, buy some technology. And so as we think about it from an entrepreneur, who should the entrepreneur go to and talk to get as an early adopter customer? We tend to think that they should go after that 8,000 acre farmer. If we're thinking about a farmer and how can they be productive, I've seen, as I say, I've seen a few business models that might work down to 1,500 acres, but they're few and far between, and take a lot of dedication by the farmer to go beyond the norm to operate effectively.
Yeah, I think I've seen programs that are out there where different organizations, and I've even seen some companies will sponsor or help to finance equipment or assets for some of these smaller farmers to adopt new practices. So, some of these things like no-till seed drills or variable rate application equipment, things like that are really expensive assets, which is sometimes cost prohibitive for smaller operations, and so that's certainly one of the barriers to entry that yeah, I mean, I've seen financing solutions that have been brought to market for folks to help them adopt.
Yeah, Billy, all the comments I just made were really around row crops, not specialty. Mm-hmm. We are seeing opportunities in specialty to use more automation that might be shared. Mm-hmm. And so I think comments like Jody's making in terms of we do think from a investment thesis standpoint that it would make sense to Uberize, so to speak, some of that infrastructure as it applies more to something like specialty. Not positive about this, but more on the specialty side where there's a combination of labor pressure. Row crop has done a lot to automate. Specialty has a little bit of a harder challenge, and then the next generation of of people that would potentially harvest are not showing up. It's very difficult, despite the immigration challenges, that people just don't want to do the work any longer at any price. So we do see an opportunity where there's going to be a natural migration of more technology into specialty to deal with yield and the harvesting. So that may be a platform under which people can accelerate the adoption of better carbon practices.
And I will say from a government perspective, I mean, the last farm bill, there were some conversations within the research space on looking at some new authorities to help leverage, whether it's specialty crop focused equipment or sort of some ag security topics, some new authorities that were provided to USDA to try to look at some of these questions, not with a carbon lens so much as more that mechanization labor lens. I think there's some tools that are already existing within that federal policy framework that USDA I think is looking to adopt. I mean, their announcement last week was looking at existing authorities and how can they use CRP and other things.
And James, this it's actually a non sequitur, but so ag seems fairly bipartisan compared to everybody else, but ag and EPA do not seem like they mix. So what, I mean, can you like do an over under on, I can imagine a lot of people getting along with the ag secretary and the farming community, but I don't get the impression that they would fall over themselves to fall in love with EPA.
Yeah, no, I think that's a challenge. It was really evident, not so much during the last administration as the previous administration, a lot of focus on water and some of those things that really hit the ag sector hard, that regulatory framework hard. And I think, looking at some of the pesticides and product limits.
Yeah.
And so I think some of those questions, when I said earlier that bipartisanship is possible, as long as folks don't let other priorities get in the way. I mean, I think those are some of the priorities that could really rankle these relationships.
Yeah, so in that environment, I recall that there was percolating along a little bit of discussion about EPA or somebody suing all the farmers for offall or effluent and things coming off the farm. And that when it was expressed to me, it seemed like that was getting pretty aggressive. Yeah. I mean, you think that will pop back up again?
I hope not. I think the dial definitely moved on the clean water front, and then in the last administration, some of that was pulled back, and hopefully those conversations aren't all reopened from day one. Looking at the data question, I mean, that's where farmers get very nervous when the government's asking for data, particularly in the livestock sector. There's been historical challenges with keeping that data, secure and not releasing it publicly. And so I think, definitely some challenges there as the government looks to be involved. And I think it's that question of what's the real goal here, making sure that farmers stay at the table and they stay in business, and it's not so much just on getting to that perfect very, very quickly.
So we're quickly running out of time, but I think we have time for maybe one last question. And so I'd like to pose it. Crusonia's central thesis is food is health, but people seem vague on carbon from a food and health standpoint. And in terms of the general public, what do you think the level of understanding is regarding carbon? It seems to be thought of in the same way people think about recycling. Is this the right way to think about it, or do you think people's perceptions will change over time?
I think from a consumer perspective, the real challenge with most topics that are complex in agriculture and science-based is that consumers have a hard time and probably 1,000 different ideas of what that definition looks like. We saw this really front and center. We've seen it over the last 20 years on the biotech conversation, biotech labeling, GMOs. And so I think it's very similar in the carbon space. Folks think that carbon in the air is bad, and they're right, but don't always recognize that the carbon cycle is natural and required to produce that safe and affordable food on the plate. And so I think it's something that will be a flashpoint for conversation in the public sphere, in the consumer sphere. But hopefully at the end of the day, cooler heads prevail. I'm not sure if I targeted that exactly, but I don't think consumers have a really good sense for what they mean when they think carbon is is a conversation they want to engage in.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that there's there's sort of an overall health halo associated with sustainability, where people kind of mix together, nutrition and what's good for the environment and things like that. And so I do think that there's a health halo, whether it's rooted in science or not. I think that people sort of equate the two things together. And so there's, I think that people have an increasing understanding and awareness of the sustainability of the food that they eat. But what I've seen is that if you ask consumers an unaided survey question, so what do you look for when you make a food purchase? The nutrition topic comes up much more frequently than the sustainability topic. If you ask folks, do you care about the sustainability of the food that you eat? Everybody, absolutely, we do. But if you ask the question unaided, you get more health than you do sustainability typically.
Okay.
Yeah, I think buried in there, we're transitioning out of the anti-GMO mode. People look at CRISPR and say, my parents just had cancer cured by CRISPR. Maybe CRISPR is not bad. That being able to affect the genetics of these situations is important to optimizing performance. It strikes me that the carbon conversation will be more reserved as one figure of merit at the B2B level. And I'm not a consumer branding kind of person, but I think that the nutritional quality issue is more dominant in the label readers than, hey, here's a carbon footprint. I don't think I've seen any CPG packaging that includes any indication of carbon footprint. It'd be interesting to see what people rank that as. But the other thing we got to recognize is, as we think about more like what App Harvest is doing and more indoor farming and synthetic biology, if I put this window out 25 years, 20-30% of production that we're seeing right now is going to be done through some form of synthetic biology or indoor farming, and we'll be in a much different kind of environment than we're currently seeing. And as venture investors, we're thinking more out 5, 7, 10 years. So I don't know if that applies to the current market.
All right. Well, with that, I think we should wrap it up. We'll keep everyone on time. I just wanted to thank James, Jody, and Carter. This was a lively conversation. It will be available on Crusonia.org. We'll have the archive up probably within the next 24, 48 hours. And we hope that everyone online, I tried to get it to as many questions as I could, but we hope you'll join us. We'll do our next Crusonia conversation on Wednesday, May 26th. And with that, I just, thanks again.